previous video, we learned about color in CSS. Now, this video is primarily about the font property, but first I'm going to show you the color property. So as you can see here, I've just created a basic page with some paragraph text, and if we switch over to our text editor, you can see our paragraph right here with the ID of my paragraph. We also have some CSS just to kind of bootstrap the page. And this is where we'll be doing our CSS. Now, I've hinted at the color property in previous videos, but now that you know how color works, its usage should be fairly obvious. Let's try changing the color of some text. So I'll just type color, and we'll use the color keyword blue. So when I switch over to the browser and refresh, you can see that we now have some blue text. The color property is the property we use to change the color of text and text only. There are separate properties for changing background and border colors. Now we can also use RGB or hexadecimal values. Let's try hex. So I'll switch over to my text editor and we'll try a nice pink color here. And when we switch back and refresh, there you have it. So that should give you an idea of how the color property works with color in CSS. Next up is the font property. The font property is actually a consolidated version of several individual properties. So let's run through them and then I'll teach you the short version at the end. The font size property, as the name implies, allows you to adjust the size of your text. The font size property can take several different types of values. The most familiar to you right now should be pixels, so let's try that first. So we'll switch back to our text editor and we'll just delete what we have here. And we'll type font size and give it a value of about 25 pixels. And when we switch back and refresh, you can see that we now have a much larger font size. Browsers will apply a default font size, but applying your own font size will override it. We can use other CSS units here, such as points, percentages, and several others. The current best practice for sizing fonts is to use ems. 1 em is equal to the current font size, and 2 ems is 2 times the current font size, and so on. Let's try decreasing the browser's default font size. To do that, we'll need to use decimal places to make a number between 0 and 1. So if we switch back to our text editor, and we change our font size from 25 pixels to, let's say, 0.8 ems, and we go back and refresh, you can see that we now have a much smaller font size than the browser default. Now let's try making the text twice as large as the browser default. To do that, we'll just type 2 ems and refresh, and you can see that we now have a much larger font size. It's best to use ems when setting your font sizes because when a user resizes their browser text, the ems will scale relative to their new default size. Moving on, next up is font family. The font family property allows you to set the typeface of your font. This is a hot topic in the arena of CSS3 because for the first time, browsers can support downloadable fonts. For now, however, we'll just be working with fonts that are built into most browsers. The font family property accepts several values separated by commas as a sort of fallback system. If the client browser doesn't support the first font, it moves on to the next one, and so on. So let's try it. So we'll switch back to our text editor, and we'll type in font family, and we'll type Georgia as our first font, and then serif as a fallback font. And when we switch back and refresh, you can see that we now have a nice serifed font. This tells the browser to put our font in the Georgia font, and if it's not supported, to just use a generic serifed font. If you're not familiar with typography lingo, a serif is just the little frills and decorations on the tips of letters. A font you're probably most familiar with that features serifs is Times New Roman. For some contrast, let's try some sans serif fonts. So we'll switch back to our text editor, and we'll delete these fonts, and in their place we'll type Helvetica, Arial as our first fallback, and sans serif as our next fallback. So when we switch back and refresh, you can see that we now have no frills on our text, just straight letters. Continuing with the font property, next up is font style. The font style property allows you to apply an italic or oblique styling to your text. Let's try italics. So we'll switch back to our text editor, and we'll delete what we have, and we'll type font style, and we'll type italic. And when we switch back and refresh, it's very subtle, but you can see that we now have some italic text. Now, similar to the font style property, you can use the font variant property to put your text in small caps. So let's try that out. So we'll type font variant, and we'll type small dash caps. And when we switch back and refresh, you can see that our text is now in small caps. Small caps is just a font styling that puts all the letters in uppercase, and letters that are actually uppercase appear in a slightly larger font. This property is used pretty rarely, but it's good to know that it's there. And to finish off the font property, there's the font weight property. Font weight allows you to put your letters in bold text. So let's try that out. So we'll delete this and type font weight, and we'll type bold, and when we switch back and refresh, there you have it. Now, back at the very beginning of all this, I mentioned you can use the font property to consolidate all of these. Let's say that I wanted some large, bold, italicized Helvetica text in small caps. I could just type something like this. So we'll type font, bold, small caps, italic, about 3 M's, Helvetica, and sans serif as our first fallback font. And when we switch back and refresh, it doesn't look pretty, but you get the idea. Now, to use the shorthand font property, you have to use these other properties in the right order of font weight, font variant, font style, font size, and font family. That's a lot to remember, and that's why it's almost always easier to just use the individual properties I just showed you. Now, the font property is very useful, and you'll find yourself using it a lot. In the next video, we'll learn about more ways we can manipulate text.